The Galactic Federation had long feared humanity, not because of their numbers or technology. Both were unremarkable compared to the great empires of the cosmos, but because of a simple, terrifying fact. No one truly understood how they fought. They were a young species, newcomers to the galactic stage, yet every recorded conflict with them told the same story. They never lost. Not once. Not against superior numbers, not against advanced civilizations, not even against enemies who had waged war for millennia. The Zelvar Dominion, a warrior race bred for battle, scoffed at the notion. They believed humans were nothing more than a fluke, a statistical anomaly that had yet to be tested by real soldiers. And so, in their arrogance, they requested a test. A war simulation. 100 of their best warriors against 100 human soldiers. A controlled battlefield. No outside interference. A perfect opportunity to prove that the myths about humanity were just that, myths. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. They look weak. Commander Vrazan of the Zelvar Dominion stood on the observation deck, arms crossed over his broad chest, his red-hued eyes narrowing at the display before him. On the training field below, the human soldiers were assembling, their movements crisp but unremarkable. "These are their elite warriors," one of his officers muttered. "They're smaller than we are, slower, weak." Indeed, compared to the towering, armored figures of the Zelvar, the humans looked fragile. Their frames lacked the dense muscle mass of the Dominion's infantry. Their reflexes, from the limited analysis so far, didn't seem superior to most galactic species. And yet there was something about them. "Where their heavy war beasts?" another officer asked. "Their exosuits? Their battle stimulants?" "They don't need them," a voice cut in. It was General Acarus, the Federation's appointed overseer of the experiment. Unlike the Zelvar, he had studied humanity. He had read the reports, the warnings, the whispered fears that the other species ignored. Vrazan scoffed. "This will be over before it begins." Acarus merely shook his head. "No. You just don't understand what you're dealing with." The first move. The battle began with a simulated orbital bombardment, standard Dominion tactics to soften enemy defenses. It was a test, not a real war, but the Zelvar still followed their usual doctrine. They rained fire on the designated combat zone, ensuring any enemy forces would be disoriented, scrambling for cover. Then, their warriors advanced in formation, confident, unstoppable. And yet, nothing happened. The humans should have been running. They should have been retreating, repositioning, anything to react to the incoming force. But the battlefield was silent. Not a single human soldier could be seen. Vrazan frowned. "Where are they?" His officers checked the scanners. No readings. No movement. Then one of the forward scouts stumbled. He let out a choked gasp and fell, blood spraying onto the dirt. No gunfire had been heard. No visible enemy had struck him. And then another fell. And another. The Zelvar tightened their formation, their confidence shifting into unease. "I don't like this," one of them muttered. "They're playing games." Acarus exhaled slowly. "No, they're hunting." The fear begins. One of the Dominion captains switched to thermal vision, desperate to spot the attackers. For a brief moment, his visor flickered, and then he saw them. Not running, not retreating, not even hiding. They were watching, scattered across the landscape, positioned on high ground, lying in wait. No unnecessary movement. No wasted energy. Every human had already chosen their position before the battle even began. They weren't fighting the Zelvar. They were toying with them. Then the assault began. The first wave of Dominion warriors were cut down in seconds. Gunfire cracked through the battlefield, but it wasn't chaotic. It was precise, planned. Each shot landed exactly where it needed to. An officer's command node, a warrior's exposed throat, the weak points in the Dominion's armor. By the time the Zelvar realized what was happening, a third of their forces were already down. The battle had barely begun, and they were already losing. Cliffhanger. Vrazan watched in horror as his elite warriors, his best, were systematically dismantled, one by one. "This isn't a war," he whispered, fists tightening. "This is an execution." Icarus turned to him, his face unreadable. "I told you," he said. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." And as the Zelvar forces desperately tried to regroup, as the first true whispers of fear crept into their hardened hearts, the realization began to dawn. The humans were just getting started. They thought it would be war, a contest of strength, tactics, and discipline. They were wrong. This was not war. This was something else, something far worse. The Zelvar soldiers had come expecting a battle of honor, of strategy, of warriors facing warriors. Instead, they found themselves prey. And the humans? They were the hunters. The Dominion forces had trained for countless battle scenarios, planetary invasions, zero-gravity skirmishes, urban combat, even fighting species with telepathic abilities. But nothing had prepared them for this. Vrazan clenched his fists as his forces stumbled through the dense, alien terrain. The battlefield simulation had begun barely an hour ago, and already, over 30 of his soldiers were gone. No bodies. No distress calls. Just gone. "They're ambushing us," one of his captains growled. "We need to regroup and—" A single gunshot rang out. The captain's head snapped back, a clean hole where his eye had been. He crumpled without a sound. Panic rippled through the Zelvar ranks. "There!" A soldier pointed toward a distant ridge, where a figure had just moved. Weapons locked on, and a dozen high-energy rounds tore through the air, only to hit nothing. The humans had already moved. Vrazan's blood ran cold. They weren't just being ambushed. They were being studied. "They know our responses," he muttered. "They know how we'll react before we do." He switched to thermal vision, expecting to find human heat signatures, but the display showed only static interference. Impossible. The humans weren't just hiding. They were controlling the battlefield itself. The fear sets in. The Zelvar warriors had started as a proud, disciplined force, but as the minutes dragged on, cracks began to form. Their tight formations had loosened. Their radio chatter, once orderly and professional, had turned to fearful whispers. "Movement at my 3 o'clock. They're behind us. No, wait. I saw something." Silence. Each attempt to push forward ended the same way. A soldier would step too far from cover, a single suppressed shot would echo, and the body would collapse, lifeless. No battle cries. No charging enemies. Just death, swift and unseen. They had never fought an enemy like this before. Vrazan could feel it, the subtle shift in the air, the way his soldiers hesitated now, the way their fingers tightened around their weapons. Warriors bred for war were now afraid to move. The humans had done something no enemy had ever managed. They had made the Dominion afraid, breaking the enemy without firing a shot. A scout team of 5 broke formation, attempting to flank what they believed was a human sniper nest. Vrazan watched through his helmet feed, expecting an engagement. Instead, the squad's vitals disappeared, one by one. No gunfire. No struggle. Gone. The silence was worse than the combat. Vrazan's breathing was steady, but he could feel it, the slow, creeping dread wrapping around his thoughts. He had fought on 100 worlds, against monsters that could tear through walls, against assassins who could kill without making a sound. But he had never fought an enemy that made soldiers disappear into the dark. No screams. No alerts. Just the slow, methodical removal of his forces from the field. He turned to his remaining officers. "Pull them back," he ordered. "We need to regroup at the—" A distant explosion cut him off. The ground shook. Fire erupted in the distance. One of his supply caches had just detonated. And then another. And another. The kill box. Vrazan's heart pounded. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The humans hadn't just been ambushing them. They had been hurting them, cutting off their supplies, forcing them into predictable routes, pushing them toward an inevitable conclusion. A kill box. They were being funneled into an open field, a place where there would be no cover, no escape. "They're driving us into a trap," an officer gasped. Vrazan clenched his jaw. No, they already did. He looked up, scanning the ridge line ahead. For the first time, he saw them. Not hiding anymore. Not running. Waiting. 100 human soldiers, positioned along the high ground. Their rifles steady. Their helmets cold and expressionless. It was not the look of warriors seeking victory. It was the look of executioners. Vrazon exhaled slowly. For the first time in his career, he understood what true fear felt like. Vrazon had fought countless battles. He had seen entire cities burn to the ground, watched armies clash with the fury of dying suns, and led campaigns that crushed entire civilizations. But never, not once, had he seen a war where one side simply ceased to exist. That was what was happening now. His soldiers weren't losing a battle. They were vanishing, one by one, as if the humans weren't fighting a war, but erasing their very presence from the battlefield. And the worst part? The humans never spoke. No taunts. No boasts. No threats. Just silence. The collapse begins. The Zelvar Dominion forces, once the mightiest warriors of the Federation, were reduced to a broken, scrambling mass. They had tried to hold formation. It failed. They had tried to flank. It failed. They had even tried to send elite shock troops in a desperate charge, only for those same warriors to never return. Every tactic they had spent centuries perfecting was useless against an enemy that refused to fight the way they expected. And now, the kill box had closed. The remaining Dominion soldiers, less than half their original number, huddled in the open terrain where the humans had forced them to gather. Vrazon's comms were filled with panic voices. They're everywhere. I don't see them, I don't see them. We have to retreat. No. We hold the line. Gunfire erupted. Dozens of Zelvar dropped before they even knew where the shots had come from. The humans weren't attacking. They were cleaning up. Precision and ruthlessness. Vrazon had thought the humans would make mistakes, that they would push too hard, give in to the adrenaline of combat, and expose themselves to counterattacks. But they didn't. Every shot fired was deliberate. A soldier taking cover, shot through the visor slit. An officer trying to rally his men, eliminated before he could finish a single order. A medic attempting to drag a wounded soldier to safety. 2 rounds. One for the medic. One for the wounded. They weren't fighting warriors. They were fighting predators. The realization clawed at Vrazon's mind, an unbearable truth settling in his chest. They're better than us. Not stronger. Not faster. Smarter. And unlike the Zelvar, they had no need for honor. The final order. Vrazon's remaining forces had 2 choices. Fight and die. Run and die. Either way, the humans would win. He tightened his grip on his rifle. There was no honor in dying like this. No glory in being picked apart like vermin. But there was one last thing he could do. One desperate act that might turn the tide, if only for a moment. Arm the plasma charges, he growled. If we're going to die, we take them with us. His officers hesitated, but one by one, they obeyed. The plan was simple. Detonate every last explosive they had, creating a firestorm that would wipe out the entire battlefield. Humans included. It was madness. But madness was all they had left. Vrazon activated his comms, broadcasting on an open frequency. You fight well, humans, he admitted. But let's see if you can outrun fire. He raised his hand and felt cold steel against the back of his skull. The battlefield had been chaos a moment ago. Now it was silent. Slowly, he turned his head. A human soldier stood behind him. Close enough to touch. Close enough to kill. Vrazon hadn't heard him approach. Hadn't seen him move. Hadn't even known he was there. The human's rifle was already raised, his visor reflecting the alien commander's face in eerie, emotionless stillness. Vrazon's heart pounded. This wasn't war. It had never been war. It was execution. Vrazon had always believed war was chaos. Battles were brutal, unpredictable, and often decided by chance as much as by strategy. Even the greatest warriors, the most disciplined armies, had to contend with the chaos of war. But now, standing in the middle of a battlefield that had been engineered to his enemy's will, he understood the truth. There was no chaos here, only control. And the humans controlled everything. The silence of defeat. The Dominion soldiers had stopped fighting. Not because they were out of ammunition or too wounded to stand, but because there was nothing left to do. Firing their weapons had become meaningless. Every shot was met with a counter-sniper round. Running was impossible. Every escape route had been cut off. Even surrender seemed pointless, because the humans had never once spoken. Not to mock. Not to taunt. Not to negotiate. They simply killed, methodically, efficiently, and without hesitation. Vrazan had never felt fear like this. Not the fear of losing a battle. Not even the fear of death. This was something deeper. This was the fear of knowing completely, undeniably knowing, that he and his entire species had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of war. They had fought as warriors. The humans fought as exterminators. The breaking point. A Dominion soldier next to Vrazan dropped his rifle. The weapon clattered against the dirt, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence that had overtaken the battlefield. Vrazan turned, rage swelling in his chest. "Pick that up." The soldier didn't move. His armor was stained with blood, his hands shaking. His eyes, once filled with the burning confidence of a Zelvar warrior, were hollow now. "They're not fighting us," the soldier whispered. "They're eliminating us." He was right. This wasn't war. This was something worse. Vrazan felt his own grip falter. He had trained his entire life for war, but no training, no history, no experience had prepared him for this. He looked to the ridgeline, where the humans had positioned themselves. They weren't advancing. They weren't celebrating. They were waiting, watching, calculating. They already knew they had won, and they were letting the Dominion forces realize it on their own. The final act of defiance. Vrazan clenched his fists. No, he refused to let it end this way. His people had fought for centuries, had conquered entire worlds, had stood at the pinnacle of military supremacy. If he was to die, he would die fighting. With a roar, he grabbed his rifle and sprinted forward, charging toward the nearest human position. If he could just get close enough, if he could force them into melee combat, maybe. Crack. The shot took his knee out mid-stride. Vrazan crashed to the ground, pain searing through his leg. He struggled, trying to push himself back up, but another shot shattered his rifle. He lay there, panting, his blood mixing with the dirt beneath him. Slowly, he looked up. A single human soldier stood at the ridgeline, rifle still raised. The human had let him live, not out of mercy, but because there was no need to kill him. The war was already over, and Vrazan finally understood why humanity was feared. They didn't just win wars. They ended them. The war was over, but the killing hadn't stopped. Vrazan lay on the ground, his body broken, his vision blurred with pain. Around him, the remnants of his army, the once mighty Zelvar Dominion forces, were either dead, dying, or too shattered to resist. He had thought the humans would pause, that they would accept surrender. They didn't, because this wasn't a war. It was a purge. The death of an army. The remaining Zelvar who still clung to life began throwing down their weapons, raising their hands, anything to signal surrender. But the humans did not acknowledge them. They did not move, did not speak. They simply continued their methodical advance, ensuring every remaining Dominion soldier was either eliminated or left completely incapacitated. It wasn't rage. It wasn't cruelty. It was efficiency. Vrazan had heard stories of species that wiped out entire civilizations in fits of bloodlust, of warlords who conquered for the sake of power. But the humans? They didn't conquer. They ended. He had fought against ruthless enemies before, but this was different. This was not the brutality of a warrior species. This was surgical, calculated, terrifying. The last transmission. Vrazan struggled to move, his body protesting with every broken nerve. His visor's HUD flickered, alerting him that a Dominion fleet was en route. Reinforcements. If he could just reach his communicator, if he could just warn them. A shadow fell over him. Slowly, painfully, he turned his head. A human soldier stood over him, rifle trained, visor reflecting the carnage. Vrazan swallowed, forcing the words from his dry throat. You don't have to, he coughed, blood staining his fangs. The battle is over. The human tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words. Then, without a word, he reached down. Not for a weapon. For Vrazan's communicator. He turned it on, broadcasting a direct signal to the incoming Dominion fleet. And then, with slow, deliberate precision, he spoke the first and only words Vrazan had heard from the humans since the battle began. The Dominion is gone. Then he crushed the communicator under his boot. Vrazan's vision darkened. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness took him was the human turning away, already moving on to the next task. Because, to the humans, this was not personal. It was just another job completed. The Galactic Federation received the transmission in stunned silence. No battle report. No demands. No diplomacy. Just 4 words, spoken in a tone so devoid of emotion that it sent a chill through every being who heard it. The Dominion is gone. No warnings. No negotiations. No survivors. The Zelvar, a race that had spent centuries at war, had been erased. And the Federation finally understood the truth. Humanity didn't fight wars. They ended them. The fear spreads. The Federation's war councils convened in a panic. They analyzed every battle, every tactic the humans had used. There were no grand strategies. No displays of overwhelming force. Just ruthless, precise, and total domination. They had dismantled the Dominion, not with superior numbers or firepower, but by outthinking them at every turn. They didn't fight for territory. They didn't fight for resources. They fought to eliminate threats. And they never lost. A simple, terrifying realization spread across the galactic leaders. What happens if they ever decide that we're next? The only logical choice. It took less than a day for the Galactic Federation to draft a formal resolution. Humanity would never be challenged again. Not because of peace treaties. Not because of alliances. But because no species in the galaxy was willing to risk what had just happened to the Zelvar. They wouldn't fight humanity. They would fear them. And they would stay out of their way. The last question. As the council chambers emptied, one young officer hesitated. He turned to his superior, his voice uncertain. "We declared humans untouchable," he said. "But what if one day they decide they want more?" His commander exhaled slowly, eyes dark with understanding. "Then," he said, "may whatever gods we worship have mercy, because nothing in this galaxy will be able to stop them."